Okay, an intro, a rare intro, with my full main on display. This episode, episode two, season one, episode two, is with Valentina, and she and I work together at Automatic. Oh, we work together with a lot of people at Automatic, and she has had this awesome journey. She's become a total thought leader kind of in the remote work space and what it means to do it correctly and to do it well and to take leading remotely really seriously. We talk about like the learned skills of successful remote work. We talk about psychological safety. We talk about like questions that you can ask as an interviewer to understand like whether or not the remote work environment is a healthy one and a productive one. This is a good one. Same questions as always. I think y'all are going to dig it. Let's do it.
Can we work remotely better? Can we do it better now? Can we do it better? What could we be doing differently? Remote work and the people making it work. Thank you, guests. You really are the ones that make it work.
Valentina, I'm really pumped that we're able to connect. It's been so exciting to kind of see your journey into sort of almost like a remote work evangelist, remote work like influencer, and I knew that I had to get a chance to talk to you. So super
Thank you
glad you're
so much
here.
for having me.
And for folks who maybe don't know you yet, I don't know how, maybe you could say a little bit about your background, sort of what you've been up to lately.
Yeah, so on the internet, you can find me under Vale de Oro everywhere, like every single social network that I engage with. That is my username. I'm originally from Germany, but I've been living for now 13 years in Spain. One of the reasons why I can live here is because I have been working remotely for over a decade, more or less. And I have been leading team the past 5 to 6 years. So I started with this way before remote was actually a thing, like pre-pandemic. And I can tell you the whole pandemic thing, that was not a work from home experiment. That was like pure crisis management. Like anyone that I know who has worked remotely before the pandemic felt the pressure of the pandemic, because working remotely means you can work from somewhere that is not the office. It doesn't have to be your bedroom. It doesn't have to be in the presence of your toddler kids. So like coffee shops, public libraries, my favorite, are all offices if you can work remotely.
That's so on point. I have said to so many people, what is happening during COVID? This is not remote work. Like
No, this is not how it is supposed to be. Like, it's of course you feel lonely, but that's not because you're missing the office. It's because you're missing your friends.
Yeah, it's because you're in the middle of like an unprecedented moment in your life.
Exactly.
Right.
And so from my work background is actually I've worked for Yahoo, I have worked for Automatic, mostly in a customer facing role. And now the past 2 years, I'm leading the product team in Klaus, which is a quality assurance platform. So basically it's a company that works with customer support people, which is why my background in customer support was like super valuable for the product role. And this is like part of what I do. And the other part is that I help remote leaders to actually become better remote leaders. Because as an employee, you can be the best remote employee in the world. If your boss doesn't know how to support you and how you can work together in a productive way, at some point you get to a point where you can't really like get better yourself, because there's like this ceiling. So by working directly with leaders, I kind of hope that the knowledge trickles down, because team leads, for example, that they can then teach what they have learned to their own people and make this a better environment for everyone.
Totally get that. And this is also the moment, it feels like, in time that so many people are ready for that and are kind of ready to hear that kind of coaching. And
Oh, totally. Actually, it's an interesting time at the moment, because it's only now that companies actually realize that just moving the office into a Zoom call doesn't cut it.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And that actually leading remotely is maybe it's a complementary skill, but it's definitely not the same as leading in an office. And there are some skills and some abilities which are all learnable. Like, this is not rocket science.
Right.
You can learn them, but you need to be willing to learn them, and you need to be willing to make experiments and from time to time fail. Because if you have been leading for 20 years in the office, you can do this in your sleep. And now you're suddenly reading remotely, and you're back in this, I'm learning something new, I'm learning a new skill. So like, accepting that, well, I'm going to screw up from time to time, but that's fine because we're figuring this out together, is an interesting challenge from a psychological point of view, because many leaders are simply not used to being put on the spot that obviously.
I think that's right. And one of the things that I've been kind of thinking about and meditating on, and I wonder what you think about this, is there are a lot of ways it feels like remote work and remote leadership kind of can reveal the weaknesses of kind of traditional management practices.
Absolutely, absolutely. It
You know what I
amplifies
mean?
them, actually.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what folks are experiencing is they maybe feel like they were a good manager in the office, and now suddenly all of the same behaviors aren't translating, right? And maybe what was actually happening is things were sort of failing to work in a way that was invisible to them. Do you know what I mean? And then
Yeah, it's invisible, and also because in the office, you can, even if you're a really bad manager, if the co-workers within your team are really good, they're going to pick up the slack. But in a remote setting, that's not necessarily the case, because the new person or whoever needs help cannot just turn around and like mimic the person who's sitting next to them, because there's no one sitting next to them. And you cannot really translate that to video meetings. And I don't think you should translate this to video meetings, because just adding more videos to everybody's day is super, super stressful. Like, our brain was just not made for this. Just today, I tried out a new tool where you can basically sit online and sit at a desk and mimic online that you are in the office, and then you can go with your little avatar into the kitchen to have lunch. And I'm like, I don't want to have lunch at my computer, even though I then can have lunch with my colleagues. I want to have lunch with my kids. So like this constant thrive to, I don't know how to live in a world where this structure is not given, so let me just mimic the structure that I know. It's kind of, think about what you want to achieve, and then like take a step back. What do you want to achieve? And then how can I achieve this with the tools that are available, instead of putting something into a structure that it was not made for?
I think that's right. I think it's as though it's this, you know, as a fellow person working in product, that kind of thing really feels to me like they're trying to like build a simulation of the office as opposed to sort of the broader outcome, right? Like, what is it about that experience that we find positive, right? Yeah, that's really, I mean, that sounds, walking an avatar of myself like to the kitchen sounds awful to me. That's product isn't for me.
Yeah, I think the whole, okay, I'm an extrovert, I feel super lonely, so how can I mimic the office, is the wrong approach. It's like, what do you want to have lunch with? Like, you feel lonely at lunch. Okay, the solution cannot be being an avatar on your computer and having lunch with someone else in a Zoom meeting. Like, can you get out there now that things are opening up again and have lunch at a coffee shop and maybe meet with friends out of town or in town who also work remotely? Like, no one's stopping you to have lunch with people that you know outside of work. Like, this is a thing. You could have friends outside of work.
It's available. You know, I wonder, in all the sort of conversations that you've had with remote leaders and your own experience, like, what's your sense of like the hardest part of working remotely? Like, what is it about the remote work environment that is so challenging?
I think the hardest part at the moment is that there are no like legitimate good blueprints that you can say, okay, this is something that works, and I'm just going to copy that and I'll be fine. Which kind of, in the office, if you come into an office, there is already a culture. This is how things work here. And when you get remote, you don't have this this pressure of this is how we work here, which on one side makes it difficult to innovate, but it also gives a huge sense of security. And I think this sense of security is missing at the moment in the remote world, because everybody is kind of trying to reinvent the wheel. Everybody who's writing about remote work is like, oh, I have the solution for you, which I think is wrong. Like, this whole thing about, oh, you cannot work in your pajamas. Maybe, but maybe you can. And actually, whether you need a really structured routine in the morning depends on you, and the type of structure that you need in the morning depends on you. So how can we empower people to actually experiment. Like, okay, this week, I'm going to get up every morning and I'm going to have a cold shower and see what this does with my productivity. And okay, this week, I'm going to put my computer next to my bed and I'm going to check my emails in the morning from my bed and see what this does for me. And for some people, it will work really well. And for some people, after that week, they're never going to leave their computer into their bedroom again. And that is fine.
Right.
So the thing is, there is no blueprint. No one is giving you kind of the guidelines where you can go towards. People feel lost.
I think there's really something to that, because when you say to someone, oh, okay, even folks who maybe have never worked in an office, right? They have a sense of like what the structure that is. You go to a place, you sit in a particular spot, you sort of bubble around a little bit, and then you go home, and work happens somewhere in there. But suddenly, this idea of remote work, it cleaves our sense of work away from all those familiar structures, right? And that is both enormously liberating, I think, but also like really scary.
It is super scary because suddenly you are responsible for everyone, and just sitting on your desk won't cut it.
Right.
Because no one is like, it's not even like, no one can see that you're sitting at your desk. And I think like companies that have been remote for pre-pandemic usually have structures in place. When there's a new hire, they get a checklist, read this, talk to that person, ask these questions. Like there is this guided onboarding that doesn't depend on anyone latching on to that person and organizing their day. While if a company just had to go remote from like today to tomorrow, because that's what it is now, there usually is not that much communication in written form, because much of the communication and of the learning actually happened in person.
Right.
So if you don't have the documentation, it's very difficult to help somebody to onboard without being in constant Zoom calls with everybody else, because what are they going to do instead? They can just stare at their computer and do nothing. So by making everybody transition without a strategy, without really knowing what this means, without the support network for the people on the team, without actually giving leaders some kind of framework that they can experiment within, that has been very, very painful. And if you add to that the stress that comes from outside, that loved ones are in a hospital, you haven't seen your parents in 2 years, etc., that's a mix that I wouldn't wish on anyone.
Well, so I'm a team lead, and I'm in this remote environment. I didn't wish for it, but here I am. Like, how do I get around this? Like, how do I help people feel safe? Like, how do I tell people on my team, like, this is how we navigate this new space? Like, what does that look like?
I think like the one thing that is kind of a non-negotiable, have weekly one-on-ones with everyone on your team. And make these one-on-ones, put the responsibility for these one-on-ones on the people that you work with. So you are not running 10, 12, 6, whatever meetings per week, but they are running their own meeting. This is, again, scary, because most people are not used to actually bringing up their things with their manager. So give them a structure, like, okay, answer these 3 questions in it, and talk about what is going on in your life more than what is going on at your work. And as a manager, that means you need to learn to listen more than you talk. Like a one-on-one is basically so that the person who's reporting to you can talk about their stuff, which means that as a leader, how can you support silence? Because it's very interesting in human behavior. If you just stay silent long enough, the other person will start opening up, because as humans, we're kind of wired to fill in the silence. And ask questions like, okay, what can I do to support you? Where do you feel you are missing something? And also checking in from time to time. So how many hours have you actually been sitting at your computer? And not to tell the person, oh, you should have been working more, but more like, wait, you log on at 8 o'clock in the morning and I see that you're answering GitHub issues at 10 at night. That is not okay. And as leaders, in this case, we actually need to be very, very obvious and very vocal about this is not okay. Like, we are hiring you to work 8 hours, 7 hours, whatever a full day is in your country, per day, and you should not be doing more, because if you're doing more, your quality will go down. Everybody else will suffer from that quality that went down. So like, take care of yourself as well. And the thing is, at work, we have these social cues. You get in when everybody gets in at 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning, and then you see people leaving, which is a cue for you. Okay, I also have to leave. And we don't have that online.
Right.
So as a lead, you need to be very clear with your employees that it is okay to log off in the afternoon.
Right.
You can actually close Slack or Teams or whatever you use for your internal chat, and that is fine. If something breaks, we're going to call you on the phone. We're not going to send you a Slack message.
Right.
So it's mostly communication and understanding where the other person's at. And this is a big difference to in-person leadership, like in the office. Because in the office, you look at somebody and you know, okay, they came in this morning like really, really upset, something's wrong. You can kind of probe, and you don't have this nonverbal communication. So you have to be kind of more obvious, and then find the way how you can make this work with different kinds of people, because some people are just like naturally more open and some people are more guarded. So how can you create this level of trust? And that requires time to actually get to a level where they're going to talk to you when they have problems.
It is so tricky. This idea of sort of empowering people to build their own structures, but still find ways to help them like navigate navigate this remote world, right? That is to say, like, you ought to be experimenting and you ought to be finding sort of how to do like your best work. But on the other side of that, also saying to people things like that you probably would never say in the office, which is like, you need to work less. Like you got to get out of here sometimes.
And I think this goes hand in hand with like, be very clear what your expectations are. In the office, the expectation is kind of, you are there for your 8 hours and do stuff in those 8 hours, but there are never real outcomes attached to it. I mean, in support, they usually are, because you have to do like an amount of calls, tickets, chats, whatever. But for many other jobs, there is no clear, like, what should you have done at the end of the day?
Right.
And for leaders, it's very difficult to say, just sit down and be like, okay, my expectations for you is this. So very often you have to actually take a step back and be like, okay, for 1 week, can you every day write down the 3 most important things that you've done? And then we can review those after this week and see like, what is realistic? And can we do this over an entire month? Because like, as a woman, my productivity fluctuates over the month. And so if I only look at one specific week, that might be a very skewed. So like looking over it, like, okay, what have you done this month? And what goal can we set for you for the next month and for the next month, so that it's something that challenges you, but that doesn't stress you out? Because if somebody's totally stressed out in flight or fight mode, they are not going to produce anything interesting either.
I think that also kind of gets to one of these fundamental challenges of remote work and sort of cleaving our work from the office and sort of from the calendar, which is like really thinking about and like focusing on results rather than like being like time present, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's hard. I think a lot of folks kind of, that's a difficult mindset to adopt.
Yeah, it requires accountability and it requires trust. And it also requires you as a leader to call people out when they're doing it correctly and when they are not doing it correctly. Because the problem with trust is not something that you earn. Trust is something that somebody offers, and then you react in accordance to whatever your evaluation is of the situation. And that means that in the forefront, as a leader, you have to trust that your people have the best interest of the company and of their job in mind, because they like their salary, because they like their co-workers, because they like this position, or because they cannot leave anywhere else, which is also a valid reason to have a job. And that's fine, but you need to trust that there is enough motivation so that they are going to go do their job. Because something that does not work is constant monitoring. Constant monitoring, they say what gets measured gets managed, but it's also what gets monitored gets worked around. So the moment that you start like installing spyware on your people's computer, or like doing random Slack messages to see if they are going to respond directly, you actually divert all the activity towards how can I look busy, and away from how can I be most impactful.
I think that's right.
Yeah, I wonder, that seems like a really good segue into kind of this broader question, which is when you think about remote organizations, especially looking at them from the outside, like if you're someone maybe like evaluating a job offer or sort of having conversations with other folks, like what would you say are like the real green flags, like the real positive signals of a mature or a healthy remote environment?
So if we phrased it as what would be great interview questions that you as an interviewee can ask to actually figure out if that company is a good fit, ask about the onboarding process. And not only about, like, ask how are the first 2 weeks or 1 month organized? Ask, are there any programs where you can connect, to be that a buddy system or an onboarding partner system or a mentorship? Ask, how do people talk about stuff that is not work? Like, are there things happening that are not work, and where do these happen? Like, is it all after work Zoom calls, which means that after your 8 hours back-to-back Zoom calls, you're going to have yet another Zoom call at night? So how is this organized? Like, how is social connection organized? If there is no COVID, how are you going to meet in real life? Because just because something is remote doesn't mean that you are not allowed to see your coworkers. And actually, a healthy remote organization will get teams together 2 to 3 times a year in some physical location, everybody together, having meals together, working together for 3 to 7 days, so that you can actually create these emotional and personal bonds that then like carry you over. And this is actually one of the reasons why even very major remote organizations are struggling towards the end of the pandemic, because people haven't seen each other. And usually they did see each other every 4 to 6 months. And this is an important part. So ask if this is kind of part of the company culture, that people actually see each other. Ask what they use for documentation and how do they manage documentation, and how they merely communicate. It's interesting also, especially if the company is within the same time zone frame, it's very tempting to still do more meetings than are actually necessary, because you can. As soon as you have the first coworker on the other side of the globe, that changes, because then suddenly when people have to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, well, meetings tend to be less attractive. So have they figured out what happens if somebody is not in the same time zone? And this kind of gives you an overview on, have they actually thought about these things? Because everybody can say, oh, we're big on asynchronous communication. Okay, do you have 1 or 2 meeting-free days per week? Oh no, like we couldn't do that. Okay, why? How long is your average meeting in the company? If meetings always default to 1 hour, something is wrong, because not every type of meeting requires an hour. Like, just because Google Calendar says it should be an hour, that doesn't mean that it should be an hour. So it's much more, instead of looking for, do they have a great remote work policy? Rather, like, what are the specifics where I can see that this is really a remote policy? Interesting question is also, do I have to check in and check out in the morning and in the evening? Or is it okay if I just appear? Do you have core work times? Like, maybe there are 3 to 4 hours a day where everybody needs to be online, and meetings will only be in this core time to make sure that everybody participates. How do you do daily stand-ups? Do I actually have to be somewhere at a specific time, or is it an asynchronous where I just like drop my status update in Slack, Teams, or whatever you're using?
Right.
So it's these small things that will show you whether the company is set up for success, or whether they're kind of winging it, more or less successful.
So what are the good answers to this, to like the asynchronous questions, right? I feel like asynchronous communication is like the big challenge for so many of these organizations. Like, what does it look like when it's really working correctly? Like when it's working really well?
One thing is, if somebody sends a message via chat, there is no direct answer. But the answer may take some time, which means people are not just on Slack monitoring, is there something that I can answer to? But people are probably actually working on something, and then they check in from time to time. Is the communication mostly in public channels, or are there a lot of private channels? because private channels by default, there's always somebody missing that should have been there and no one remembered that they should have been in the private channel. And then you're like 3 weeks later, oh, now we have to add this other person and they have like 3 kilometers of text to read to catch up. Just making it an open channel, and then unless it's like hiring or super sensitive, and then people can just see, oh, this is something that I should also be answering to. So by having less video calls and more written communication, either in a chat tool or even better in a discussion tool.
Okay.
And that can even be Google Docs. Like you send a Google Doc, you share with whomever you need feedback from, and then they have 48 hours to comment. And then you have discussions in the comments. Or you have a GitHub issue, and it's not really a tech issue, it's a question. And then people discuss in the GitHub issues, but there is 48 hours, because the thing is, asynchronous communication is slower than synchronous communication on the surface, because you don't have a meeting where you can just quickly talk about it and then it's done. But you can start when you have the idea. So actually in the long run, it's quicker, because you don't have to find a meeting slot where everybody actually has time, which might be 2 weeks from now. But you can like put your idea out there now, people can discuss. You can always go back and see what was actually the proposal that was done in the very beginning. And you don't have like meetings where on week number 3, in meeting number 3, you don't even remember why you started this meeting succession. So written communication is like a huge part of asynchronous. If you don't know how to write well, start learning it now.
Well, like, how do you make those decisions? I feel like that's like such a problem, right? Is it feels like when I'm engaged with a conversation asynchronously, it feels like it's interminable. Like, you mentioned 48 hours. Like, what does that look like? You say like, I want to make this decision by like Friday.
So usually what you can do is first, it needs to be very clear who is going to make the decision. And companies are not democracies. Like somebody is going to make that decision, and that person will also live with the consequences of the decision. And I think this needs to be very clear. And this is also a little bit scary, because if you make the wrong decision, like you might screw something up, but it's a learning opportunity. So if I want to have, like, for example, for a product decision, if I want to have input from other people, I make a GitHub issue. And then I ping all the people whose input I want. But I also know that more people will see it, because some people just have show me everything that happens in GitHub in their notification settings. Yeah. So that's fine too. And then I usually say, okay, and I need an answer by Friday, because on Monday, I'm going to read through this. Mm-hmm. Friday, meaning because I know that some people will end up having a great idea on Saturday night and still add it. Since right. I'm only going to see it Monday, that's good enough. And then during the week, I already check in who has commented and might clarify or ask additional questions. So I'm going to kind of engage with the conversation as it's going on. But on Monday, I am going to make a decision, and I'm going to put at my last comment, I'm going to put the decision that I've taken, why I have taken it, why I have not taken into consideration whatever I decided to take out. And then I'm going to close the issue, and that is the decision. And very often we come all to the same conclusion. And sometimes I'm like, look, I know we are not all on the same page here, but we need to make this decision. And I am making this judgment call today. And if we realize it's wrong, we'll have to course correct. And you can say, ha, I told you so. But luckily, that doesn't happen too often, because not making any decision basically means you have accepted the status quo as the decision. Right. Without anyone being accountable for it. And that in the long run is really difficult for any company or any culture to actually sustain.
I think that's right. I think that's right. It's also can be really scary to sort of be the decider, right? To be so visibly the sort of person who's going to make the call.
But that's the thing. Remote is scary because it puts everyone on the spot, because you can't hide in the messes anymore. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Like your contributions suddenly are super visible. Your like whether you participate in chat or not is visible. Whether you comment on whatever your comment system is visible. Whether you show up for the meetings is visible, because they might be recorded for the future. So it is scary. Many people who are not used to be on the spot have a hard time learning this. So for a company, it's very important to make sure that create this safety that it's okay that you are not always right. And I have made mistakes, and I've told the entire company, look, this decision was wrong and I'm really sorry. How can we now make sure it doesn't happen again? And we are learning from this, because we are all humans. We will all make mistakes. It's just part of human nature. And then the question is not, have you never made a mistake? The question is, what have you learned? And if it was something that could be mitigated with a better structure, how can you adjust your processes to minimize that the same mistake happens again?
I think that's right. I think that's a really healthy way to think about it. In these fully remote organizations that sort of are engaging in high trust situations, allowing people to be vulnerable, sort of making it safe to make decisions. What's your sense of like how do you get there? Like, how do you get to really excellent people management, really excellent team management? Like, what does that look like? What does that process look like for a remote or a newly remote organization?
Trial and error, lots of experiments. And a very open feedback culture. And I wouldn't even call it feedback culture, because if you ask somebody, hey, do you have some feedback for me? It goes like, so ask if they have some advice for you. That usually works, because people love to give advice.
Yes.
They hate to give feedback. So words do matter. And then you cannot change from one type of organization to another in 1 week. And we've just realized that this does not happen. But what you can do is make small experiments every week and refine on what you're doing. And I'm a huge fan of actually calling these experiments, because the idea of an experiment is that it goes wrong and you learn something. If all your experiments turn out great, you're not making enough experiments.
Right.
Any chemistry teacher will tell you that. So basically okay, let's experiment with icebreakers at the beginning to the meeting, even though I think this is completely stupid and something for, I don't know, kindergarten. But let's try. Okay, and then you try and it completely bombs because you asked for what is your favorite memory from your childhood, and then you realize that one of your coworkers is hugely triggered because their childhood was nothing to be remembered nicely. So then you start to adjust this, and then in the end you end up with icebreakers that maybe are like, okay, which animal is the rudest and why? And then people start to discuss whether an owl is ruder than a fox or whatever, which is completely safe, but also makes people get out of their shell in a very non-threatening way. So these are things that you learn as you go. Now, as we're having now a lot more people talking about remote work and writing about remote work, get inspired, like follow people that write about this and that share their experiments so that you can use these experiments. Just because something worked for me does not mean it will work for you, but it will give you ideas on how you can develop something that works for you.
Right.
So because there is no blueprint, but there are recipes, and then you kind of adjust whether you want like more curry or more oregano in your recipe.
Well, it also, I think, expands kind of your sense of what's possible, right? When you see
exactly
kind of what other people are questioning, that sort of allows you, it gives you permission almost to say like, oh yeah, like the thing that I have assumed was the way that things have to be isn't, right? Like that isn't necessarily the case.
Yeah, we have a channel at Klaus that's called Remote Tips, and every 3 or 4 days I'm like, oh, I found this cool thing that we can try, and I can see people are like, oh, okay. And then we try some of the things and some we don't, because we read through them and it's like, okay, that won't work for us. But it's really fun, and like half of the things we try and then we never try them again, and it's fine. But some of them stick. Like and what? Then we continue to use them.
Like what has stuck? What
the hot seat, for example, we have a channel. It's called Hot Seat, and every week on Wednesday at 12 p.m. Is that? Yeah, I never know why it goes from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Makes no sense, but whatever. We know there's a new person that goes on the hot seat, and then everybody can ask this person questions in Slack, and the person answers in threads. And the questions sometimes are very like, what's your comfort food? What's in your fridge right now? What is on your desk that should not be there? Like very low profile. But then there are also things like, let me see. well, what are some illegal things that you have done is something typical.
Just get
How
it
do
in
you
writing.
prevent animals from eating each other in Noah's Ark? Who would be the best grandmother and the best grandfather in this company? And why? The and why is always the interesting one.
Oh, of course.
Which haircut did you have when you were 16? Please share a photo.
So what is it about that kind of practice that you feel like what is that opening up for people, right? That isn't like making them write more code, you know, it's not helping them like think about products better. Like what's happening there that like makes it stick, that makes it like an important part of the organization?
It connects people and it gives you an insight into people's humor. Because in the end, what connects us is humor. When we laugh about the same thing, this creates like magic between people. So you learn something from people by the questions they ask. So even if you are not on the hot seat, if you ask questions, people get kind of an idea. Are you somebody who asks like very clear, very let's say logical questions, or are you somebody who like paints a picture of a fantasy world before the question comes at the end? And then you realize that with some people you relate to them because you would have asked the same question, or you relate to them because you're like, whoa, I would never have been able to like come up with that kind of crazy question, which is also something that you then admire, that person is so creative. And then just because the person on the hot seat has to answer the question doesn't mean that the other people don't have to answer the question. So you can answer any question that's being asked to the person on the hot seat. Out of courtesy, usually we wait until the person on the hot seat has answered and then everybody else answered. But then in the threads, there are sometimes really nice conversations going on about parenting, about favorite food, about where, if you would have to organize our next grand meetup, where would it be? Like stuff like this that makes us dream a future of the company together. And it's like a creative way, and you can do this whenever you want. So usually after I've nominated the next person, lots of people ask questions and then it dies down. And then the next bunch of questions comes on Friday afternoon. Why? Because people are wrapping up, they're just checking through it again, they put a bunch of questions and then they leave for the weekend. And then usually on Wednesday morning, when they're like, oh, it's the last option to ask this person a question, another bunch of questions come in. And the person who answers, some answer the questions as they come in, some batch them, like you can see they put apart half an hour on Friday evening to answer everything, and then on Tuesday morning or something, which gives you also like an indirect insight on how do they work from a productivity point of view. So it gives you like an interesting view of that person, that if you only talk about work and only always talk about solutions, you would never had. And it's very interesting because the things that you have answered in the hot seat might come up in completely different opportunities, because somebody remembered that you like gin tonic or that your cat is brown or whatever.
Well, it's really interesting that, you know, this conversation sort of started with like, what does excellent like people or team leadership look like in a remote environment? And it sounds like a part of it, if I'm hearing you right, but like a part of it isn't even about like what you would think of as like traditional people management, but much more like how you create a culture or like an environment that people can kind of exist within as employees and as colleagues.
So for me, the difference is between people management and people leadership.
Okay.
And I think people management, you can very much automate this. Like you can ask everybody to do a check-in on Monday and write down what they did the week before. You don't need a meeting for that. Like everything that you need to know from a work point of view, you can get that because it's hopefully written down somewhere. But the important part in remote leadership is the leadership part, and like creating this connection with people, getting to know them and trusting each other that you are going for the same goal. And what we realized is there is a lot less office politics in a remote world, because if you have to write down your theories, you kind of think twice because it takes longer, so it might just not be worth the hassle. And do you really want somebody to screenshot that and share it to someone else?
That's interesting. That's interesting. Yeah, sort of like permanence as like misbehavior reduction is kind of
Yeah.
I hadn't thought about
Or maybe there are lots of private channels that I'm not part of in our company, and everybody is talking about me, and I just haven't realized it.
I'm sure.
But at least it doesn't make me feel miserable because no one is looking at me weirdly as I pass through the hallway, because I'm not passing through the hallway.
Well, there you go. What's your sense of if folks want to learn more or sort of hear about what you're up to? Like, what's the easiest way for them to do that?
You can find me, and actually I have I did a talk without slides the other day because I thought people are super slide tired. So this was my slide. You can find me search for Valle de Oro. I'm mostly on LinkedIn.
Okay.
And on Twitter a little bit, on Instagram on and off, and not as professional as on LinkedIn.
Of course. Okay, and I can link to all of those in the show notes as well.
Exactly. And then there's my name.com, is valentinathörner.com, is also my website, but it's probably easier to go to LinkedIn and click through because my name is not the easiest to spell.
And you have an accelerator that's starting shortly too, right?
Exactly. And I just opened the applications for the Remote Leadership Accelerator, which is a 4-month program for people who really want to level up their remote leadership in a small peer group to learn together with. So my problem, or my gripe with many of the online leadership programs, is you get lots of framework contents in like 4 weeks and then go, and then you're on your own. And there's so much information that you have not applied that you lose half of that, and then you're in a group with like 25,000 other people and you don't end up knowing anyone. Right. Because I believe the remote leadership really hinges on this getting to know people and getting like personally in being invested in the success of the people on your team. I wanted to bring this to an online program. So there will be a maximum of 20 people in this program. We're going to work very, very close together in over 4 months, and it will be mostly asynchronous. There will be 1 or 2 calls per month, but it will be mostly written and asynchronous so that you can experiment what it is to be in a really asynchronous environment and still create very strong connections to other people.
That sounds great.
And applications are open now. Early bird ends July 10th, and we start on September 6th.
Awesome. Perfect. And I can link to that too. And
exactly.
This was awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.